Sorry, but
Alex, you are present as well. Okay, that's great. Okay, sorry about that.
No problem. But the lead author was not, due to a last-minute problem, he could not attend. So he asked me to present.
Okay, that's fine.
Sorry about that. But anyway, I hope I can present it in an adequate way. So this presentation is will give you some information about our model, about the source and the stress transfer scenarios of the Samos earthquake. It is relevant to the two previous talks, but we have some differences, and it is very interesting to have this exchange of ideas and information. So this is a cooperation between the Department of Geology at the University of Thessaloniki, together with our colleagues at the Hellenic Survey of Geology, as well as the School of Rural and Surveying Engineering, who helped us with the geodetic information. I'm going to go through quite not very detailed with the first few images, because we have discussed them extensively during these 2 days. This subduction of the African plate beneath the Eurasian plate, as well as the westward movement of Anatolia, causes the formation of a very complex geodynamic regime. This is a scheme by Taimas et al. 2007, which is generalized, let's say, deformation pattern of the area. Of course, there are some individual and local variations, but I think this map shows the distribution of deformation in a good enough way. The study area is somewhere between this boundary. So as I will show you later on, this plays an important role in the nature of earthquakes, as well as the structural manifestation. This map, I showed it also in my previous presentation, but it shows the various types of crustal deformation using the GPS/GNSS data. And there are zones of intense deformation and zones of less intense deformation. And I'm going to go through these. So we have a very diverse faulting environment with faults of various types in the area. And this is a good, they are in good agreement with the focal mechanisms of the main shocks. You can see here some, the red focal mechanisms correspond to thrust faults, to reverse faulting earthquakes, the blue ones to strike slip, and the black ones to normal faults. Although there are some, let's say, clear areas of distinct faulting, there are some areas that the style of faulting is mixed, as for example, in southeastern Aegean and western Greece, etc. And this is due the complexity of the general geodynamic complexity. This is a map with the epicenters for the period since 1964. Of course, we are all familiar with images like that, and a very intense distribution of seismicity in the area. Now let's focus in the study area of Samos earthquake. The data, historical and instrumental data, show that the area is not very, let's say, quiet from the earthquake point of view. There are a lot of strong earthquakes. Some of them are estimated, of course, for the especially for the older earthquakes. However, the seismicity here can produce earthquakes of magnitude 7 or even larger. So this October 30th earthquake is indeed one of the largest in the area, but it is not uncommon for the area. As mentioned before, the area is characterized by both strike slip and normal slip faults, as shown by the various focal mechanisms here. They are from Kiraji and Louvery 2003, and this is due to the concurrent operation of strike slip and normal faults in the area. Some faults, this area has this peculiarity that some faults are well documented in the mainland. However, some are not so well documented because they are located offshore, and their location can only be identified by seafloor morphology, earthquake epicenter distribution, and seismic profiling wherever available. If we look at the seismic sequence of the Samos earthquake, we can see that the epicenters are more or less located in an almost east-west direction, and this is in a good agreement with the distribution and the location of the Kaistrios fault, which has been described in previous studies, and is included in the Greek database of seismogenic sources. So there are the focal mechanisms, especially from the main shock and most of the aftershocks, show that these are they are in agreement with an east-west, almost east-west fault. However, there are some other mechanisms that are consistent with strike slip faulting of different orientation. So let's see some the distribution in space and time of the epicenters. During the first day, 13 October, the main distribution was around this fault. This is the main shock, and the first cluster started to develop towards the east. However, there is a distant cluster here, which is evident since the first day. By moving on to the next days, we can see that these clusters, the second cluster, starts to build up more activity, and the third cluster is starting to form in this area. I have to say that this distribution is the first distribution. They are not relocated epicenters, and I will compare these maps to the relocated epicenters in the next slide. Moving on, in time, we see that these clusters start to get the activity is continuous in these clusters. However, a few days after the earthquake, there is another cluster, a D cluster, which is developed quite away from the main, from those three main clusters. So there are a few questions here, especially regarding clusters B and D. The main question is which fault produced them, because they are not, I think it is clear that they were not produced by the main seismogenic fault. If we compare these maps with the maps published by Chatzipetros et al. 2020, with the relocated epicenters, there is quite a good agreement with the first cluster west of the main shock, the second cluster southeast of the main shock, and the cluster here north of Ikaria Island, with another cluster which, however, is not very well defined near the coast of Turkey. So, as far as the surface effects are concerned, they have been presented by the previous speaker as well as yesterday by Galanakis and collaborators. This map is the neotectonic map of Samos with just the faults. This has been compiled by Muntrakis collaborators several years ago. And the surface effects are shown in this map, mainly concentrated to the north coast. However, as we saw in previous presentations, there are also some features, some effects in the south and so. One of the most interesting effects is the ground ruptures in this area in northwestern Samos. They seem to be secondary because they are located along mountain slope. However, they are very consistent in their strike, and they produced mainly opening, but also some vertical displacement. And this northeast-southwest strike is something that I'm going to come back again later. This strike here is consistent with the strike of this fault by Muntrakis and collaborators, which is not very clear onshore, but we believe that it is associated with Ikaria fault to the southwest. So our model is somewhat different from what previous speakers suggested. We selected this fault because its source here, because we think it is in good agreement with a mapped fault, which is this one that is included in the Greek database of seismogenic sources, but also it is in good agreement with the distribution of most of the aftershock sequence. So we propose that this is a almost east-west structure of about 40 kilometers long. And it is also in good agreement with the Kandili Observatory focal mechanism. And also it is, again, in good agreement with the measured and the actual displacement, especially in Samos station. So this is a comparison between the actual GPS measured displacements as with the modeled displacement. We used the Okada model, as previous authors did as well. Of course, it has its limitations because it has the Okada model suggests that there is an elastic hull space and uniform slip, which we cannot be certain. However, they are in very good agreement, Samos and Ikaria stations. This model comes in good agreement. So we think that our proposed source model is confident enough. And you can see the comparison between the GPS displacement values and the model displacement values. In most cases, they are very similar. So based on this source model, we tried to calculate the Coulomb static stress chains on the fault during the sequence, as well as off the fault post-sequence activity. These are the distributions of the Kandili Observatory catalog. They are not relocated. They are, however, we use them because they have there are a lot of them, and we can have a first approximation of the distribution of seismicity in the stress drop and stress rise areas. So in each of the figures that I'm going to show you, we have a longitudinal cross-section and cross-sections perpendicular to the fault. So these three sections show the distribution of earthquake activity, of aftershock activity, and they are not, you see here that they are not very well defined in respect to the model fault. However, most of them are located in the stress drop area due to the stress release of the main slip, of the main shock. If we use the relocated hypocenters, we see here that the distribution is much, is a lot better. They are concentrated around the model fault. And again, we see here those two clusters that are at least problematic, or they pose some questions, and I'm going to discuss them later. Another cluster here, cluster C, is located away from the main fault, and it is, again, poses a question if it is produced by a fault or by another fault of different geometry and kinematics. This cluster C is not, was not very clear in the previous distribution, but it is clear in the relocated distribution. So, for checking in and trying to find out which faults produced the different clusters apart from the main fault, we used all those faults around here. They are modeled faults in GREDAS, Greek Database of Seismogenic Sources, with their parameters, and we used each of them for as a receiver fault of the stress released during after the main shock. So just a quick overview. In each of those maps, you see that different faults have been taken into account in order to see in the cross sections if they correspond to stress drop or stress rise, and if we can possibly correlate them with the distant clusters. So the main issue here, the main thing here is that this fault, which is the Karlova-Sifurni fault, shows a stress increase in its upper part, which is in good agreement with the second cluster, cluster B. So we believe that the second cluster was produced due to the reactivation of this fault. And another possibility was the Ikaria fault, which is here. However, the cross-section here shows that the stress rise is very low in respect to the Karlova-Sifurni fault. So this is a more probable source of activity. The cluster A, which is located here, is between those the main shock and the cluster B, can probably be associated with a transitional zone between those two faults, and they are in good agreement with the ground ruptures that I showed you in the previous map. The rest of the faults that have been modeled, the receiver faults, do not show any significant stress drop or stress rise. So they are differently affected, but they do not show any indications of post-sequence activation, post-sequence activity. So to conclude, the main, some of the main conclusions, we see that the aftershock distribution shows development of different clusters, and we believe that those clusters were formed due to the reactivation of adjacent faults due to the stress drop or stress rise from the main fault. The ruptures that were observed, generally they are scattered, except the northeast, southwest striking ruptures in northeast, northwestern coast, which are consistent with the of a model of transitional structures between the two main faults, the east-west main fault and the adjacent Karlova-Sifuni fault. Another important point is that the GPS recordings show a very large displacement of 37 centimeters, which was quite surprising, and much less displacement in other stations. However, this is consistent with the model that we propose. And the proposed fault is along the northern Samos coastline. It is, we propose an east-west structure dipping to the north. And this is consistent with the modeling, again, with, of course, with its limitations, with Okada displacement models, and the GPS measurements, the GPS values, they are all in agreement with the proposed fault. So we found also some distribution of stress changes, both stress rise and stress drop in various faults. And as I said, the different clusters appear to be produced by transfer of stress into adjacent faults, either on stress drop areas or on stress rise. This is, we think that both regimes can produce those clusters. So these were also the conclusions from this proposed model. And thank you again for your attention.